The biggest dilemma that a feminist will have when discussing gender issues in society with men's rights activists and red pillars is how do we reconcile a feminist perspective when up against the legitimate issues brought up by advocates for men's rights? It turns out that question is actually a pointless question because it's not a real dilemma. Feminism will and has advocated for raising awareness of men's issues, and for working to help alleviate men from the issues that afflict them. What this means is that if men's rights activists have any legitimate points at all, then any feminist, myself included, can just reply by saying, yes, I agree with this, and the dilemma is over. The problem is when advocacy for men's issues and feminism are seen as incompatible. Oftentimes, it's men, particularly anti-feminists and men's rights activists, who try to present these ideas as though they're inherently incompatible with feminism, or as if feminism would altogether reject these ideas. In fact, the opposite is true. Many times, feminists not only accept these ideas, but are the first to identify and raise awareness of these issues that affect men. Even further than that, a lot of the feminists raising awareness for these issues are men. However, it's worth noting that it's not only men or anti-feminists that portray men's issues and feminism as incompatible. Sometimes it is also other feminists. It's important to distinguish, though, that feminism isn't monolithic, that the rhetoric that is relatively anti-man is actually stemming from particular subgroups within feminism. Particularly, a lot of the anti-man rhetoric comes from radical feminists. My own feelings on radical feminism change over time, and I tend to fluctuate between agreeing with radical feminism to some extent but being very skeptical of how they approach advocacy and discourse, and alternatively, thinking radical feminism is an inherently problematic ideology that often ends up being white-centric and cis-centric. That said, I myself have a history of adopting the anti-man convictions that a lot of radical feminists showcase, but I drift in and out of these convictions, where sometimes I think that men really are at such an inherent position of power over women that interaction between men and women always creates a power dynamic where women can stand to be easily harmed by men, and I resent men for this. Other times, I find myself more inclined to see men as allies in a mutual goal of working towards a better world where gender doesn't negatively affect anybody. The reason I say all of this is because even with one singular feminist, there's the capacity for differing understandings, the capacity for nuance and complications, and that's perfectly fine. It's okay that feminists are sometimes wrong, or sometimes do shitty things, because, again, feminism isn't a monolith. People can do terrible things, and even do terrible things in the name of an ideology, and while we should all feel some responsibility in dealing with the issues that these people cause, it doesn't make sense to hold feminism as an entire branch of thought accountable for some feminists having the tendency to exclude men, to downplay men's issues, or even to straight up harm men. While we should all work to prevent these kinds of things from harming people, the bad apples in this bunch don't actually spoil the whole basket, because feminism is a massive branch of thought, and the various smaller groups within it can exist independently of one another and sometimes even at odds. After all, within feminism can exist both trans feminism, a movement dedicated to taking special notice of issues affecting trans people, and trans exclusionary radical feminism, a movement dedicated to actually causing issues for trans people. The good news is that I'm willing to extend this same reasoning to the red pill community in theory. After all, not every red pillar is going to believe something as ridiculous as men being emancipated from women's tyranny through virtual porn. However, the reason why I don't extend it to red pillars in practice is because, well, the very foundation of the ideology is bullshit, as I mentioned in the previous sections of this video. However, there's good news for any red pillars who are still managing to watch this, because if you wish feminists would take your ideas seriously, there's a whole documentary for that. It's called The Red Pill, and I'm going to explain why Cassie Jaye's The Red Pill is full of shit. Let's dig into it. Cassie Jaye's The Red Pill is full of small issues that I could critique that ultimately play into one major, compromising issue for the film. The documentary is severely uncritical of its subjects and what they have to say. Most of this is Cassie Jaye herself, who seems to pay lip service to thinking deeply about what is being said to her, but really isn't at all. If I were making a documentary about the men's rights movement, a major thing I would want to do is find disproof, contrary evidence, contrary arguments, some form of tangible complication or refutation of what was being said. This isn't a loaded effort either. It's a regular behavior of academia to challenge things as rigorously as we can to see if they stand up to all of the other data available. And we not only do this for other people's claims, but even for our own. This is a large part of why anti-feminist movements have no grounding, because feminism is rigorously tested in various fields and has been substantiated academically by a lot of really acclaimed people. Even some of the feminists interviewed in this documentary, like Michael Kimmel or Michael Messner, have a large body of work discussing feminist issues, particularly men's issues, in detail, and combing over them very thoroughly. It's not something you can go up against with a populist movement, because an emotional conviction against feminists doesn't stack up against the hard facts that are largely in favor of feminism. Cassie Jaye interviews her subjects, especially the men's activists, with a quote-unquote open mind, but with what appears to be a complete lack of knowledge in regards to what the people she's interviewing are actually saying, and how much what they're saying does or does not actually hold up. Because of this, she presents a rather uncritical look at what the red pill and men's activist movements believe, and as a result, it becomes little more than a free PR campaign for that community. I'm not going to comb over every single claim made in this movie, but I took notes on a lot of the bigger arguments and particular things that stood out to me, and I'm going to explain why this documentary as a whole just doesn't work. Structurally, the film goes through various men's rights claims by topic, and jumps around through quite a few of them. I won't be able to get to everything said in the movie, but I will respond to statements and claims as they come.
The idea is that men have all the rights, they've always had the power, but if that's true, why can't men talk about their problems?
This complaint is something that I find pretty interesting because it's very common, and it stems from the basic problem of not being able to see the forest through the trees. Yes, on a micro level, looking only at the self or at your immediate surroundings, it might seem as though men have it terribly. However, the failure to recognize the systemic causes of these immediate surroundings is what makes this question a complete non-starter. Men can't talk about their problems because men have all the power. Patriarchy pushes men to adopt self-devaluing standards of masculinity such that reaching out for help is discouraged, and trying to help fellow men is also discouraged. To the men's rights movement's credit, there is on some level a noble attempt amongst men to help their fellow men, though the same cannot be said of the red pill community as a whole. What's unfortunate here is the failure to listen to women and to listen to feminists who actively have been trying to help men through these issues on both individual and institutional levels. This will become a repeated response throughout the rest of this video. It's because of patriarchy. These statistics, if I'm being completely honest, are a good thing to show in order to make the claim that men are being devalued in society. I fully agree that men are often treated as expendable, and this is not a good thing. However, the framing here is poor, so let's frame it better by explaining 4 points. 1. Women often want to be fighting in the war effort alongside men, but because of misogyny, women are often forced out of the line of fire and into less intense positions. 2. It's not rich and powerful men being sent to war, it's often poor and working class men, which shows that it's in one way largely a class issue. It's not that men are being devalued compared to women so much as poor men are being devalued compared to rich men. 3. The issue here should not be that not enough women serve in war, in my opinion, but that war exists at all. Ideally, the issue here is that human life at all is seen as expendable, something which I can't agree with. 4. It's because of patriarchy.
They saved all the women first. That's still, when I went on a cruise, there's still women into the lifeboats first, but because you're a man, you're expendable.
Yes, I agree. This is bad. What now? This is one of the major problems of men's rights activists. Feminists can and often do agree on a lot of their points, but that in no way causes feminism to be invalidated or proven wrong or anything. If I agree, that actually makes MRAs look bad, because it shows that on points where they actually have a point, a men's rights movement is futile because feminists already can and have been working against these kinds of things. All that said, I do think there's a missing piece of the puzzle here, and this is speculation, so don't take it as a citation or anything, but I think the reason why women and children are encouraged to get to safety first is actually a component of misogyny, because women are seen as needed for reproduction and specifically for replenishing the workforce. Women are only being saved for their wombs, making this really a form of benevolent sexism. Yes, it does sort of mean that men's lives are being seen as expendable, but if you ask me, that's a consequence of the capitalist mentality where someone's life value is seen directly in their ability to provide work or workers. As a result, men and women are dehumanized by this process, and it's just a bad form of etiquette all around. Though I do think children should ideally be saved first for reasons that I hope I shouldn't have to explain.
We have to look at not just the glass ceilings, but also the glass cellars. We have to look at men just not only as human doings, but also as human beings. When you survive because somebody else is willing to die, like in war, then that you are immune to the pain of the people who are dying because you have an investment in their being willing to die. You say, I will build a statue, I will remember you in a history book. But if you look at that from another perspective, that building of the statue or remembering you in a history book is a bribe to be willing to die so that I can live.
This is something that sort of just sounds like complete nonsense, but what I gather from it, I think he's trying to argue that women stand to benefit from not dying in war while men do, and I just... What? Like, yes, it's better to be alive than it is to be dead, but nobody stands to benefit from this situation except those who have a vested interest in the war itself, like those who orchestrate the war and send people to die. If a woman's husband dies in war, for example, that isn't a net gain for the woman, on either subjective or objective terms. There's no way to argue this except to reveal some form of misogynistic bias, that women inherently think of men as expendable, which, even the avowed misandrist that I am, I do not think of men as expendable, and neither do most women.
We have the same rules set up for men that they've always lived by, that you need to protect and provide at any cost. But we've changed everything where it concerns women. They now have access to everything men have always had access to education, to work, to whatever they want to do, but they're not the ones driving the semis, and they're not the ones in the coal mines. You don't hear the National Organization for Women complaining that there is just not enough female ditch diggers. It is still men carrying the lion's share for what it takes to operate and maintain this society.
This is sort of true on the surface, but has some glaring faults underneath. First of all, women weren't able to fully shirk off traditional gender roles, and in many ways, systemic attempts on behalf of, well, men in power, to limit feminism led to a stagnation period, especially starting in the 1980s. Statistically speaking, both men and women want more egalitarian relationships in the United States. We want to shirk off traditional gender roles within the family and have women as breadwinners and men as caregivers at a more even rate than historically. But because of that systemic stagnation, men and women are often forced into traditional gender roles because of the system incentivizing it. Simply put, men don't get to shirk off a lot of these roles because the system makes it so that men and women both can't survive unless women rely on men to take on traditionally masculine roles. In other words, it's because of patriarchy. Another thing worth noting is that the male-dominated professions that the movie portrays as being hard work that are being pushed onto men, again, this is a class thing, because it's working class men and not rich men. But it's also a thing where women have tried to enter into these fields, but faced high levels of discrimination and harassment and barriers to entry because the system doesn't make it feasible for women to become manual laborers or construction workers or do the dangerous jobs. And when they do, men take it upon themselves to make it fucking miserable for women.
So where do the men's movement and feminism disagree?
Well, only on the fundamental belief that the women's movement says men are the oppressors, that we are involved in a patriarchal world in which men invented the rules to benefit men at the expense of women.
You have to look at this in a larger perspective. Patriarchy is the result of gender roles and not the vice versa.
Okay, well, it's time for me to explain patriarchy to people. If you don't like boring lectures about how systems work, then, well, you maybe should learn to care about this stuff because it's really important and it affects everyone. So let's begin. The argument that patriarchy is the result of gender roles is bullshit. Here's the thought. If trying to embody gender roles leads to having systemic power, why is it that trans men are basically non-existent in positions of power? You would think, right, that if men are socialized to do things that end up giving them positions of power, then trans men, who experience the same messages and seek to embody similar forms of masculinity to cis men, would be more represented in political or economic power. Instead, nothing. Why also is it that mostly white men have positions of power in the United States? Is that because of race roles, or is it because of power imbalance creating a feedback loop? And that's why patriarchy creates gender roles. Think about it like this. Let's say we wipe the board at every generation. A new set of rules every 20 or so years. Let's say that those in power in the media and in politics and in economics use that power to construct the world and, by extension, gender roles. Men will be raised with those gender roles, will grow to hold positions of power statistically, and then they will wipe the board clean and set their new list of rules. That new list of rules will be an extension of what worked for them: masculinity, white superiority, economic incentives, etc. By this token, men will write a new set of rules that, while probably different in some way, will improve the exact track they were on, which will make it harder for women to hold positions of power because they aren't trained or given the opportunities systemically. And each new generation will see this happen more and more because the path that makes it easiest to put people into positions of power is one that is currently written by men. That's how patriarchy works. It's not the list of rules itself. It's the mentality that the men in power have when they write those rules. They write those rules to improve a system that already favors men such that it will favor men more. Feminism's goal of opposing patriarchy is opposing this feedback loop and trying to find some way to provoke the people making the new rules to create some sort of systemic lock that will prevent the continued privileging of men. So to even say patriarchy is the result of gender roles rather than vice versa misses the point. The two are circular. Gender roles are the rules written down, which then privilege men towards success and power, which then causes them to adopt a mentality which allows them to create further systems that privilege men further. The mentality they adopt is patriarchy. Patriarchy's statistical numbers, the representation of men in politics, is a result of patriarchy, which is a mentality that is both fueled by gender roles and creates gender roles. The reason why this is important to point out is that feminist analysis has already figured all of this out, but MRAs haven't gotten that far, so they're saying things that sound appealing and make you think, but they don't actually have answers because they aren't analyzing how systems are constructed.
I was a math major as an undergraduate, and one of the fundamental things about geometry is the distance from point A to point B equals the distance from point B to point A. And if women are so different from men that men can't understand the female experience, we need to listen to women to describe it, then the male experience is so different from the female experience that you can't understand it. You need to listen to us. You can't really compare how men and women have suffered from sexism, because there's no way to quantify, that kind of suffering.
This basic math thought experiment sounds fine in a vacuum, and to some degree it will be true. Women do not truly know how it feels to be a man, at least if we're sticking with people who fit within the gender binary snugly. I even agree to this vague notion myself on some level as a trans woman. In fact, I've written and gotten an article published describing how my experiences, even though they are typical experiences for what you would expect a man to go through, were experienced very differently because I'm a woman. Yes, that is totally an excuse for a plug. Go read my article, it's good. Women can, however, understand men better than men can understand women when it really boils down. Here's why. Media is controlled by dominant groups, because dominant groups have the power to determine what we do and don't see, what we do and don't hear. I already outlined that men hold the majority of power in media, and as a result, we see almost all media through the lens of men's perspectives, or what is more commonly referred to as the male gaze. Men's perception, men's perspectives are literally broadcasted to women in such a way that while we can't know the experiences of men fully, we can understand them because for our entire lives we have men's perspectives hammered into us. In fact, that issue is so pervasive that I've already discussed the issue in part 7 of my series, How Gaming Culture Maintains Male Dominance. And in that video I outlined some of the long-term effects on women's sense of self because of how much our sense of self is affected by a pervasive masculinized media. All of this is to say that women, we do understand men, because in the society in which men control most of the information that we receive, women see a lot more of what men believe and what men go through and what men see than vice versa, meaning that men are increasingly distanced from women, while women are increasingly more likely to be sympathetic to men, which, well, just about 100% summarizes the issue of the red pill community and men's rights communities as a whole. Feminists already sympathize, but men do not think that's enough, and if you ask me, I think that's because men have a very difficult time sympathizing with women, which forces me to remind everybody again, it's because of patriarchy.
Men in the men's movement are not upset about having to be fathers. They're upset because they're not allowed to be fathers.
I've always thought of feminism as being the fight for gender equality, and yet I've never heard about fathers' rights and the injustices going on in family court. Why is this?
So this is another topic that showcases the different axes along which social issues occur. On the one hand, when it comes to the issues of divorce and custody, it is very much true that women often get custody and that this can often be very painful for the man in the situation. I am entirely on board with recognizing the pain that this can be for men and how, in terms of the system, there is some degree of the system devaluing men as fathers. However, on another axis, I've heard an argument from feminists that there's actually a patriarchal dynamic here as well. The argument goes like this. Children are, in the eyes of the system, seen on economic terms. Whoever has custody of the children bears the most brunt of providing time, energy, and money to caring for the children. As a result, the judges, who are often men, will likely give men independence so that they have greater economic value, thus encouraging men to focus more on being good workers and earning more money, and conversely encouraging women to be financially tanked as a result, which then leads to a lot of pressure for women to then find new husbands to become financially dependent on, rather than going alone. This argument is further validated by government programs that explicitly try to turn single mothers on welfare towards marriage rather than economic independence. Literally, Congress outlines that two of the purposes of the welfare program are to push single mothers into marriage to reduce out-of-wedlock pregnancies and have their children under a two-parent household. It's also worth noting, in addition, that, statistically speaking, women actually have everything to lose from both marriage and divorce, while men have everything to gain from marriage and oftentimes don't even take it seriously. And yeah, the results of men being valued in terms of economy rather than humanity still dehumanizes men in the process, by portraying a man's value as inherent to his work and his money. And this pressures gender norms, and it also callously ignores the emotions a man can experience for losing his children. This can all be true even in a situation in which men hold most of the power, for a very simple reason. Say it with me, it's because of patriarchy.
I decided to create a flowchart of what I thought father's options might be following a surprise pregnancy. I then put a green line for the paths that I thought would be good turnouts for the father, and I put red lines for the paths that seemed to not be good for the father. Then I created a flowchart for women's options, and did the same with green and red lines. And as I stepped back, I saw all the red lines for the women's options if she does not want the child. But something dawned on me. Of every path the biological father could go down, he's at the mercy of the woman's sole discretion. Although women have very difficult choices to make, she at least has the choice.
Okay, so the men's rights activists actually have a point, because I did the math in my head, and it turns out that, there's men and there's women. And if you'll permit me, they could either have a boy or a girl, right? I mean, that's perfectly logical and everything. And the thing is that, there are both good and there's bad outcomes for this. And, if the man wants a boy, that would be good. And if the woman wants a girl, that would also be good. If the woman wants a boy, that would be good, because then she would have a man of the house. But if a man wants a girl, that would be bad, because girls are terrible, and so, why would you want to have a daughter? Anyways, also, marriage, the thing about marriage is if a man wants a woman, that's a bad thing, right? Because nobody wants to marry a woman. But if a woman marries a man, that's a good thing, because she gets all his money. Just fucking loads of money. And I'm gonna add a few more lines here because it's a good thing, right? But, if they want a dog, then double good for the woman, because she gets to stay home all day and play with the dog. Meanwhile, the man has to go to work. And here's work over here, right? Up here. And the man has to go to work. And the thing about going to work is that work sucks. And you don't get time to play with your dog, or your boy, or your girl that you don't want. And so, and then, there's a house, right? Then you got a house. And the woman gets it's her domain. So that's a bad thing. Oops. Anyways, the man, he likes to work sometimes. But, he doesn't like to be home, because that means he has to spend more time with his wife. And that's just not a good thing. But it's also a good thing because his boy is at the house, right? And so the boy is just getting all sorts of great things. He even gets a dog. But if he has a sister, that just fucking sucks. Because we don't like women. We're just gonna, we're gonna cross out the girl. Let's just take her out of the equation. Anyways, if you look at the graph, we have men, we have women, we have boy, we don't have girl, but we have dog. And the important takeaway is that dog is good. Dog is good. Just a few more of that. And the thing about the dog is that the dog eventually dies, and that's bad for the man because he has to bear the emotional burden, and the woman benefits if the dog dies, because if the dog dies, then she gets more money off of life insurance for dogs. And so really, when you think about it, when you look at all of the possibilities for men, it's bleak, okay? Because men, they still have to go to work. They still have to get a job. They still have to be married to a woman. They still have to care about the girl that they no longer have. They, and then even the boy, even the boy is a bad thing. Because if you have a boy, then what if he turns out gay? If he turns out gay, then if he turns out gay, then that would be bad. And so that would be really bad for the man. But for the woman, it'd be really great because women like gay guys. They're big on gay men. It's a huge thing, And so if you look at this graph, you can just see the male oppression at play. I mean, male oppression, right? Male oppression. See, I can't even fit it on the rest of the board because men are so oppressed that they don't even get room on this board. So if you think about it, all the bad outcomes that men have, all the bad outcomes, it's just disturbing. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
My initial reaction was that there needed to be thousands more women's shelters because that many more women are being battered. But as it turns out, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination?
Alright, so domestic violence arguments. Oof, where to even begin? I actually studied this in school, and as it turns out, the pop culture claims that women are just as likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence as men is based on a very lengthy debate that was based on poorly defined terms. The question we need to ask is, what is domestic violence? The most immediate and obvious answer is that if physical hitting or assault is involved, then it is domestic violence. This is how one school of thought surrounding the domestic violence claims formulated their approach to documenting domestic violence. As a result, they found it to be pretty close to a 50-50 split of both men and women physically assaulting their partners. However, the other school of thought, the one that argues that this issue affects women predominantly, has been using domestic violence in a more specific way, physical abuse that ties into a pattern of abuse. As such, there have been different terms describing different kinds of domestic violence. The 4 terms used to describe domestic violence are intimate terrorism, violent resistance, situational couple violence, and mutual violent control. Intimate terrorism refers to a pattern in which an abuser will commit acts of physical or sexual abuse in addition to emotional abuse and control. Things like making it difficult to leave the relationship, forcing financial dependence, threatening to kill the person if they leave the relationship, and so on. These are the scum of the world that a lot of people picture when hearing the phrase domestic violence. Violent resistance refers to when someone who is in an abusive relationship, someone who is being abused by an intimate terrorist, will strike out against them as an attempt to resist the abuse or even to escape. While this is technically physically assaulting a partner, it's not typically viewed as domestic violence by the media or by analysts of these issues. Situational couple violence refers to violence perpetrated by one of the partners as sort of an isolated incident, not part of a pattern of abuse, but one temporary occurrence of physically assaulting a partner. These things are seen as domestic violence, but are typically not the pop culture image that people associate with the phrase. Mutual violent control refers to, well, a situation in which both partners are involved in trying to control each other through violence. And this one is statistically at an exact 50-50 split because by definition it has to be a situation in which both the man and the woman are abusing each other. This one isn't particularly relevant to the conversation we're having now, though. The problem is, when feminists and advocates for victims of domestic violence are discussing the phenomenon, they're referring largely to intimate terrorism, in which a pattern of abuse is at play. And this is also what most people think of when they think of domestic violence. Meanwhile, men's rights advocates are actually discussing situational couple violence when discussing the women are just as likely to become violent with a partner as men claims. So in that sense, they're actually discussing two different things. So let's break down this myth. When you account for the different kinds of domestic violence, 89% of the people committing intimate terrorism are men, meaning 89% of the people who have a pattern of abusive behavior, terrorizing and controlling their partner, are men. Violent resistance is 85% women, and situational couple violence is 55% men and 45% women. So what this means is that while there is a near even split between men and women committing isolated incidents of physical assault, there are still more men committing isolated incidents of physical assault than women, and pattern abusers are almost always men by a much higher percentage. Ultimately, what this means is that the claims that men's rights advocates are making are not only inaccurate to the statistics, but are also framing women's capacity for isolated incidents of physical assault as equally horrendous to men's capacity for patterns of extreme abusive behavior and control. This is, at best, a very poor attempt at understanding an issue, and at worst, downright manipulative. I'm sorry, but domestic violence is still predominantly carried out by men. Just for good measure, I'll quote the article that I'm pulling this information from. It's titled, "Control and Violence in Intimate Relationships." When someone goes on television or publishes a paper to pronounce that the survey evidence proves that women are as violent as men in intimate relationships, they're suggesting that women are as likely as men to be batterers and abusers, intimate terrorists. And the suggestion is not subtle. They tell stories about some of the few women who are, indeed, intimate terrorists, or they're on a talk show in which the panel consists of girls who beat up their boyfriends, or men who are afraid of their wives. But we have just shown that survey data about violence are only about situational couple violence, not intimate terrorism. Intimate terrorism is in fact perpetrated almost entirely by men. And situational couple violence isn't anything like intimate terrorism. Here are some data about the violence perpetrated by the men from the Pittsburgh study. The violence in men's intimate terrorism is quite frequent. The modal number of incidents in these marriages is 100. The modal number of violent events in men's situational couple violence is 1. Intimate terrorism escalated in severity of violence in 72% of the cases. Situational couple violence escalated in only 29%. In terms of injuries, the violence of intimate terrorism was severe in 67% of the cases, compared to 29% of the cases of situational couple violence. These data do not leave much doubt that intimate terrorism and situational couple violence are not the same phenomenon. We need to make these distinctions.
And when it was addressed as a men's issue, the speaker's point was that it's a men's issue because men are the problem.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues.
Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said, it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
There's something I'd like to bring up about this documentary, which is that, first of all, they feature Jackson Katz discussing domestic violence and sort of take what he said out of context, which makes it seem like Jackson isn't sympathetic enough to how men are negatively affected by these things. And rather than debunking the lack of context, I'll just provide a link to the talk that Jackson Katz gave so that you can see it in full for yourself and hear a more proper, comprehensive perspective. Second, they feature Michael Kimmel and Michael Messner in this documentary, which, to the movie's credit, I don't feel that they were horribly misrepresented, though I do feel that they were horribly underutilized, and I think that creates a very lopsided discussion. After all, if the goal is to look into the men's rights movement, it might also make sense to look into critics in such a way that gives the critics a chance to respond to the claims being made directly by others in the documentary. I instead sort of assume they were asked more abstract questions that makes it so that these feminist voices in the film have to respond to the entire vague concept of the men's rights movement, which gives them no time to properly refute the specific claims made by Malmrose in the documentary. It's worth noting that Kimmel and Messner were both editors in a book that I featured prominently in my series, How Gaming Culture Maintains Male Dominance. The book is called Men's Lives, and the particular article I cited for the video was written by Kimmel himself, and it's called Gender, Class, and Terrorism. I've also referenced Kimmel in relation to his concept of aggrieved entitlement in my video, YouTube Skepticism and the Identity Politics of Toxic Masculinity. These guys are seriously good and were done a disservice by this documentary, so I thought it was something that should be pointed out that these guys, as well as Jackson Katz, are pretty respectable sociologists, and they deserve better than what this movie portrays them as. This one is going to be hard to talk about because there's no right way to talk about such a tragic, politically charged, and emotionally intense issue as major human rights violations, and of course, to be more direct, mass murder and how it's reported in media. As a white person and as a person born and raised in America, I'm extremely distant both literally and psychologically to the lives of those affected by the very real misery inflicted by terrorist groups in places like Africa. And while I want to be as sensitive and sympathetic as I can be, in order to talk about this topic, I'll need to treat these issues as more hypothetical than they are. I hate having to do this, but in the context of this video, it's difficult to avoid, so please, if I say anything out of line or insensitive, please let me know. In the interest of complete fairness, I think that this argument is probably the hardest argument to contend with in the entire documentary. The argument goes that Boko Haram mass murdered young boys, but it went underreported in the news. But when Boko Haram kidnapped a much smaller amount of young girls, it was reported heavily. Similarly, the news often frames these mass murders of men and boys as people being killed, while whenever women or girls are killed, it's framed as women instead of people. First of all, the reason why men and boys being slaughtered is portrayed as people is because of the perceived default of privilege where, for example, straight people are just people while gay people are gay people. That's why we often hear separate distinctions between Americans and African Americans. We hardly ever hear anything about European Americans in mainstream news or in political talks because that's a presumed default that is stated when just simply saying Americans, as though all people in America are white. The term for this phenomenon is markedness. Markedness refers to the asymmetrical nature of binary statements in language. The article, The Deafening Echoes of Marked Language, uses a few examples, and one of the best examples they use is virgin. We have a word to describe the concept of a virgin, someone who has never had sex. However, we don't actually have a word to describe the opposite of a virgin, as in someone who has had sex. Although these days we may finally have our antonym courtesy of the great Chads of the world. Point being, the concept of a virgin is lopsided because it portrays being a virgin as inherently abnormal and non-virgin as inherently normal, so normal as to not even have a word to describe it. Similarly, happy and unhappy are antonymic, but also lopsided. Unhappy, by virtue of being an extension of happy, is inherently othered, inherently different from the normal state of happiness. This is also why people can use man as a gender-neutral term to describe humanity, but the inverse, using woman as a gender-neutral term, seems strange. The language surrounding women is marked, and marked language portrays women as inherently out of sync with the default state of being, and thus, by contrast, men, as the assumed default state of personhood, will be seen as so normal as to not even require being designated a specifically gendered identity. Thus, we get a situation in which news outlets will portray women victims as women and men victims as people. What this does is it showcases the privilege that men have in society such that anything that happens to men is normalized as something universal. If it happens to men, it happens to people, as though it's not specifically happening to men. What I'm saying is that this is a terrible thing. But it's terrible because men already hold the power such that the experiences are presumed to be universal and thus not in need of being specified as an experience specific to men. Again, this argument does hold some weight, but, as the saying goes, it's because of patriarchy. This is also a hugely nationalism and race-related issue. The America-centric news outlets are likely going to skim over issues that occur overseas in general, and part of that is because our news only cares if victims are American, but also often only cares if victims are white. The devaluing of men and boys in this situation is, again, not general, but specific. This isn't the devaluing of all men. After all, it's not devaluing rich white men. It's devaluing specifically black men and boys, and of course, to be even more specific, black men and boys from overseas. The degrees of separation from privilege are such that the lack of reporting shows white-centric and America-centric values. And the irony here is that this example of Boko Haram's mass murdering of black boys actually demonstrates white-centric and America-centric mentalities among men's rights activists. Granted, this documentary was made a while ago, but it's worth noting that this woman featured prominently in a viral video has been the target of harassment, rape threats, death threats, and doxing, all because of her getting angry once in a conversation at a feminist protest. In interviews I've seen her in, including the one featured in this movie, she comes across very reasonable, open-minded, and humanitarian. But because she told a guy to shut the fuck up, she became the face of everything wrong with feminism. I wish the documentary would do more to combat this notion, but instead the same issue appears of Cassie Jaye treating all subjects without much critical thought. The portrayal of feminist protests in this is a bit lopsided in portraying feminism as unreasonable and loud and obnoxious. On one hand, I could argue, well, you're not giving enough time to showcase the reasonable feminists who don't act like assholes at protests, but I feel that that would be a bit beside the point. The point I want to make is this. Okay, yeah, sure. The people at the protest featured in this documentary were acting like assholes. Now what? How does this have any direct relation to feminism? Feminism isn't a movement so much as it is a branch of thought. It's hugely academically substantiated and includes many, many movements under its banner. You can point to any rally, any protest, any organization to try to portray feminists or feminism as bad, but it'll only ever be a reflection of those people you're pointing to, and not the entire branch of thought, because the branch of thought is too expansive and too vague even to be flawed inherently. The only flaws are flaws of subgroups, not foundational flaws. TERFs, for example. Many feminists hate TERFs and openly disavow them. And while TERFs technically fit under the same basic branch of thought, they share no similarities to someone like myself, a specifically trans-affirming feminist. Similarly, some protesters yelling at people at a university are not a reflection of myself or the millions of feminists who are not those people, nor the ideologies within feminism, nor the branch of thought as a whole. So it's just ultimately meaningless as a commentary on anything more than the fact that, yeah, sometimes people can do shitty things. Not a very impressive revelation. Alright, so the main event that inspired this movie was an article written by Paul Elam declaring a particular month the Bash a Violent Bitch Month, and Cassie Jaye, initially appalled by this, decided to look into men's rights advocacy. She eventually found that the article was a response to a Jezebel article in which a woman made a post talking about how great it is that women sometimes hit their men. This was Cassie's rationale for defending the Bash a Violent Bitch Month article. Alright, here goes. 1. Jezebel isn't a particularly respectable source of feminism. 2. The person who wrote the article appears to be a largely quote-unquote comedic writer for the site. 3. Even looking at the comments on the Jezebel article, a lot of people were appalled by what she was saying and thought it was an altogether terrible article, so even fans of Jezebel agree it's bad. 4. Paul's response was not a parody so much as an embittered reactionary response to a bad comedy article. His rationale was, if it's okay for her to say that, then it's okay for me to say this. It's not. It wasn't okay when she said it, and even Jezebel fans seem to at least partially feel that way. 5. It's doubly not okay when Paul says it because, well, refer back to my lesson on domestic violence and how it's much more prominent for men to be pattern abusers who abuse much more severely than women. So even if we try to portray the rhetoric as equally bad, the actual lived implications of the articles are extremely lopsided. One of the last things brought up is male circumcision and how it mutilates children. I agree with this. Lots of feminists do. In fact, I'd be willing to cross my fingers and guess that most feminists do, but that's just a guess. Like, I don't think circumcision of any kind is acceptable, and it's a brutal, outdated practice that should not be legal in our fucking country. And the fact that it is depresses me. Ultimately, what all of these complaints made in the red pill get at is either a conflation between class and race issues with that of some sort of supposed oppression of men, or a misreading of the actual nuances of situations, or an inability to identify that the culprit is patriarchy and capitalism rather than women, or a complete non-issue made out to be an issue, or an issue that feminists already agree with and are already trying to do something about. It's sort of mind-blowing to see so many inaccuracies play out in real time this way. The movie is just so sloppily done. Basic fact-checking or research can refute most of it and complicate the rest of it, and it's really just not a very good film in any regard. I think perhaps the biggest flaw with the film as more of an artifact is how it centers itself so heavily around men's rights activists while calling itself the red pill. Now, picking the most seemingly reasonable people within a community and giving them a chance to present a PR version of their ideology on camera is a great way to portray a community as a glowingly positive community. The movie does a lot to humanize these people, and to its credit, that's a somewhat valuable thing. Even people who are wrong or who are misguided deserve to be humanized so that we can better understand the issue. That's the major reason why I decided to discuss this movie. Because I've already discussed the more extreme articles in the previous sections of this video, so now is my chance to look at some of the more reasonable, more PR-friendly arguments put forth. It turns out those arguments are also bullshit, which doesn't fare well for the community. What bothers me is how the film covers up a very dark underbelly to the red pill community. By focusing on the MRAs and not so much on the kinds of people like Roosh V who actively advocate for legalizing rape, it doesn't present the community as what it really is. But that darker underbelly takes an even darker turn when we recognize that the red pill community doesn't exist in isolation, but instead overlaps with other communities. Stay tuned.